A stray dog barked 3 times in court. What happened next left everyone in tears. Inside a packed courtroom, chaos erupted when a stray dog suddenly burst through the doors, barking sharply once, twice, 3 times, before settling right in the middle of the room. Moments later, something happened that left the entire room frozen in stunned silence. What was this mysterious dog trying to tell them? Tension crackled in the air as the most talked about case of the year unfolded, a high-stakes legal showdown that had captivated the town for weeks. Every seat was filled, reporters scribbled furiously, and spectators leaned in, eager to catch every single word. At the bench sat Judge Matilda William, a veteran magistrate with a reputation for her no-nonsense approach. Her gavel rested within easy reach, ready to strike at the first sign of disorder. In the defendant's chair sat a well-known businessman, accused of embezzlement. His face was unreadable, flanked closely by his team of sharp-suited attorneys. Across the aisle, the prosecution braced for their final argument. Then, without warning, the heavy oak doors creaked open. At first, no one paid attention, but then came the soft, rhythmic tapping of paws against the tiled floor, an unusual sound in such a place. Heads turned, a collective gasp swept through the courtroom. There it was, a stray dog, scruffy and gaunt, walking calmly down the aisle. Its dusty coat clung to a frame so thin that ribs were clearly outlined beneath the fur, and yet there was something unshakably sure in its stride. It paused at the center of the room, eyes scanning every face like it knew exactly why it was there. The room fell into a stunned silence. Even Judge William, known for her ironclad authority, paused mid-sentence. Her eyes narrowed, puzzled. Just as the bailiff stepped forward to remove the dog, it let out a single, sharp bark. Heads turned. The bailiff froze mid-step. Then came a second bark, louder, more forceful, its gaze locked unwaveringly on the defendant. A ripple of unease moved through the courtroom. Murmurs stirred. Why was a stray dog here? And why was it barking at him? Before anyone could intervene, the dog barked a 3rd time. Each sound rang out like a deliberate signal, echoing through the chamber with eerie precision. Then, without another move, it sat down. Its tail gave a faint wag, like it had completed its mission. The defendant shifted in his seat uneasily. His eyes flicked from the dog to the judge, the calm crack in his composure starting to show. Judge William lifted her gavel, ready to restore order. But before she could speak, the bailiff gasped and pointed toward the dog's collar. There, dangling beneath its scruffy neck, was a tiny key. It glinted under the courtroom's harsh fluorescent lights like something pulled from the shadows of a mystery novel. The entire room froze. A key! Why was it there, and what could it possibly unlock? The air grew thick with suspense. Every breath was held, every eye locked on the dog, sitting so calmly in the room's center, the key catching the light and scattering it across the faces of the speechless crowd. Judge Matilda William, career jurist, woman of reason, found herself uncharacteristically speechless. She leaned forward, fingers gripping the edge of her bench. "Bailiff," she said at last, her voice slicing through the stillness. "Secure the dog." The bailiff hesitated, then cautiously stepped forward. The stray didn't flinch. Its gaze stayed locked, piercing and unwavering, on the defendant, Rowan Daniel, the affluent businessman now on trial for embezzling millions from local charities. Daniel shifted in his seat, his perfectly composed exterior beginning to show signs of stress. The dog's presence was clearly getting to him. "What's going on here?" his defense attorney snapped, rising sharply from his chair. "This is highly irregular. Remove the animal immediately." Across the room, the prosecutor remained still, eyes focused on the unfolding scene. Prosecutor James Edward, famous for her sharp instincts and even sharper cross-examinations, leaned toward her assistant and whispered, "He's nervous." "Why?" Meanwhile, the bailiff reached the dog and knelt to inspect the collar. The stray remained still, as if fully aware of the moment's importance. With gentle hands, the bailiff unhooked the small, rusted key and held it up. "Your Honor," he said, voice laced with disbelief. This key was attached to the dog's collar. A key? Judge William echoed, her brow creasing. What does it unlock? Before anyone could speculate, the dog rose and began walking, slow, steady steps toward the defense table. Gasps rippled through the room as it stopped directly in front of Daniel. It sat down again and let out a low, deliberate growl. Daniel flinched. His complexion turned pale and his hands clenched the edge of the table. "Is this some kind of stunt?" his lawyer exploded, voice taut with outrage. "Your Honor, this is an outrageous disruption." Judge William raised her hand sharply. "Enough," she said, her voice cutting through the building tension like a blade. "Bailiff, secure the dog and move it to the side for now. Let's return to—" "It's building beautifully." "Wait," Prosecutor Edward interjected, rising from her seat. "Your Honor, may I examine that key? This could be relevant to the case." Judge William hesitated, then gave a curt nod. The bailiff handed over the key. Edward studied it intently, turning the rusted metal in her hands. Her sharp eyes narrowed, then widened slightly as she spotted something faint etched into the surface. An emblem she recognized. "This symbol," she said, holding up the key for the court to see, "matches the logo of a private storage facility here in town, a facility linked to Mr. Daniel." The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Daniel's lawyer leapt to his feet in protest, but Judge Williams silenced the room with a sharp bang of her gavel. "Order! Prosecutor Edward, go on." Edward stepped forward, her voice calm and assured. "Your Honor, we've been investigating Mr. Daniel for months. We have reason to believe he used a storage unit registered under a false name to hide incriminating evidence, documents that directly prove the embezzlement. This key could lead us straight to that unit." Shock rippled through the crowd. Phones buzzed. Reporters leaned forward, but Judge William remained composed. "Do you have sufficient grounds to request a warrant for the facility?" she asked. "Yes, Your Honor," Edward replied, already producing a prepared motion. "Given this new evidence, I believe we have more than enough probable cause to execute a search immediately." "This is outrageous," Daniel's lawyer barked, slamming a hand on the table. "You're granting a warrant based on the behavior of a stray dog? This trial is turning into a circus." Judge William fixed him with an unblinking stare. "Mr. Jasper, if your client has nothing to hide, then he has nothing to fear. Prosecutor Edward, your motion is granted. Bailiff, accompany the prosecutor and ensure the warrant is executed without delay." The bailiff nodded sharply and exited the courtroom alongside Edward, who held the key tightly in her grasp. The dog, still seated near Daniel, watched them leave, its tail giving a faint, almost triumphant wag. Daniel had gone from pale to ashen. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering furiously, while the attorney struggled to maintain his composure. Back at the bench, Judge William turned to address the courtroom. "We will adjourn until further notice," Judge William announced. "Bailiff, ensure the dog is looked after and kept safe. This situation is unprecedented, but we must follow where the evidence leads." As the courtroom began to empty, a hum of whispers filled the air. Who was this dog? How did it know to bring the key? And what would they find in that storage unit? Judge William remained seated, her eyes following the dog as it was gently led out. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of intrigue, something she hadn't felt since her earliest days on the bench. This wasn't just another trial. And that dog, it wasn't just a bystander. It had become something more, a silent witness, a catalyst. The courtroom cleared, but the questions only multiplied. What secrets were locked away in that storage unit? And why had a stray dog become the thread unraveling it all? Outside, the tension was thick as Prosecutor James Edward and the bailiff sped toward the storage facility. The rusted key felt heavy in Edward's hand, heavier with every passing minute. It wasn't just metal now, it was a promise, a reckoning. She couldn't stop thinking about the dog. Its strange, purposeful behavior replayed in her mind like a scene from a movie. What were the odds? What force had brought that animal to the courtroom at that exact moment, carrying that key? Back at the courthouse, Judge William sat in her chambers, still wrapped in thought. Something didn't sit right. There was more to this case, more than evidence and legal briefs. Daniel's reaction to the dog hadn't just been irritation, it had been fear, genuine, bone-deep fear. Meanwhile, in a private room elsewhere in the courthouse, Daniel paced like a caged animal. The calm, polished mask was gone. "This can't be happening," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "How did they even know about the storage unit?" His lawyer, Jasper, tried to steady him. "We don't know what they'll find. For all we know, that key means nothing." But Daniel wasn't listening. He froze at the window, staring into the distance, his jaw clenched tight. "If they find those documents," he said quietly, "it's over." Across town at the storage facility, Edward and the bailiff arrived with warrant in hand. The facility manager, a wiry man in his 60s, looked puzzled as they explained why they were there. "You're telling me this key came from a dog?" the facility manager asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Edward didn't flinch. She nodded, her tone unwavering. "Yes, and we believe it opens one of your units. Please, we need your cooperation." The manager sighed and shrugged, leading them down a narrow aisle to a storage unit matching the serial number on the key. The air was thick with tension as Edward inserted the key into the lock. It clicked open with an unexpected ease, and they stepped into the darkness beyond. The bailiff flicked on a flashlight, its beam cutting through the shadows to reveal rows upon rows of file boxes, neatly stacked and waiting. Edward's heart hammered in her chest as she stepped forward. She opened the nearest box and her breath caught in her throat. Inside, the contents were meticulously organized. Ledgers, contracts, receipts, each piece of paper telling a damning tale of embezzlement, money laundering, and fraud. "This is it," Edward whispered under her breath. "We've got him." As word of the discovery spread back in the courtroom, chaos erupted. Reporters scrambled to revise their stories, eager to be the first with the breaking news. Whispers filled the air as the crowd buzzed with excitement. Daniel's lawyer shot to his feet, demanding a recess, but Judge Williams' voice rang out sharply, denying the request. "We will proceed as planned," she declared firmly. "If the evidence is admissible, it will be presented." Daniel, his face slick with sweat, leaned toward Jasper, his voice low but urgent. "You need to stop this," he hissed. "There's got to be a way to discredit that evidence." But Jasper's confidence faltered. He shook his head, his voice carrying a note of defeat. "The key came directly from the dog, Daniel. This isn't something we can talk our way out of." Meanwhile, at the local animal shelter, the stray dog, now temporarily in their care, rested peacefully. The staff couldn't help but marvel at his calm, almost regal demeanor. "It's like he knows he's done something important," one worker said, scratching behind the dog's ears. They decided to name him Justice. It felt right. His unexpected heroism had made him a symbol of something greater than himself. Back in the courtroom, Edward entered, holding boxes of evidence. The room, packed to capacity, crackled with anticipation. She stepped to the front, presenting the first batch of documents to the judge. "Your Honor," Edward began, addressing Judge William with quiet authority, "these records confirm that Mr. Daniel has been siphoning funds from several charities into offshore accounts." She paused, then added, "The transactions are detailed and traceable." As if to underline her point, Edward held up the small, rusted key. This key was the missing link. The defense leapt to their feet, scrambling to object, but Judge William's gavel came down with authority. "Let her finish," she commanded, silencing them. Edward pressed on, her voice steady and resolute. "We believe these funds were meant for underprivileged children, medical research and community housing projects. Instead, they were diverted into accounts controlled by Mr. Daniel under multiple aliases." The room fell deathly silent, the weight of Edward's words settling heavily over the crowd. Daniel, his once rosy complexion, now drained of color, shifted uneasily in his seat. His face flickered from red to pale as the gravity of the situation sank in. The businessman who had walked in with the air of someone untouchable now appeared nothing more than a cornered animal. As the proceedings wrapped up, Judge William addressed the courtroom with unwavering authority. "Based on the evidence presented today, this court has sufficient cause to proceed to trial. Mr. Daniel, you are remanded into custody until further notice." The gavel struck, and then chaos. Reporters scrambled, eager to file their stories. Spectators whispered in disbelief, exchanging stunned glances. The prosecution shared quiet nods of satisfaction. But amid the flurry of activity, one question remained on everyone's lips. How had the dog known to intervene? Outside the courtroom, Edward paused for a moment, taking in the cool air. She glanced up at the overcast sky, the weight of the day finally catching up to her. The case had turned in their favor, but she couldn't shake the thought of justice, the stray dog that had turned everything upside down. Sometimes, she murmured to herself, the universe works in mysterious ways. As she walked to her car, the feeling of the mystery still lingered, nagging at her. The trial was far from over, but one thing was certain. Edward now had the upper hand with the damning evidence. And yet, the questions about the dog remained unanswered. How had justice acquired the key? Why had it appeared at that exact moment? That evening, as Edward returned to her office, the phone rang. It was from the local animal shelter. The staff member on the other end was practically buzzing with excitement. "Miss Edward, you need to come down here. It's about justice. There's something you need to see." Her curiosity piqued. Edward made her way to the shelter. Upon arrival, Justice greeted her with a wagging tail, his eyes warm and intelligent, as though he recognized her. Lila, a young worker at the shelter, handed Edward a small, faded dog tag. "We didn't notice it earlier," Lila explained, but Justice had this tucked beneath his collar, hidden under the key. "It looks like a name tag." Edward examined the tag closely. The engraving was worn, but the name was still legible. Hugo. Beneath it, there was an address on the outskirts of town. Edward's curiosity was piqued, and she knew she had to follow this lead. The next morning, she made her way to the address on the dog tag. When the man saw the tag in her hand, his eyes widened. He gasped in disbelief. "Hugo!" he cried, his voice cracking. "You found my Hugo!" Edward explained the situation gently, recounting the dog's unexpected heroism in the courtroom. The man introduced himself as Ethan Dawson, a retired locksmith who had lived alone for years. His voice trembled as he spoke of Hugo, his loyal German shepherd, who had gone missing months earlier during a storm. "I thought I'd lost him forever," Ethan said, his voice heavy with emotion. "He's more than just a dog to me. He's my family." Edward, still holding the dog tag, asked Ethan if he recognized the key that had been attached to Hugo's collar. Ethan studied it closely, his expression shifting from joy to confusion. His brow furrowed as he muttered, "That's one of my old keys. I used to make spare keys for people around town, but this one belongs to Rowan Daniel." Edward froze, the implications of his words sinking in. "Rowan Daniel, the defendant in our case?" she asked, her voice low. Ethan nodded slowly, his face clouded with concern. "Yes. Years ago, Daniel hired me to make keys for a private storage unit he owned. He said it was for business and he paid me extra to keep quiet about it. I didn't think much of it at the time. But is this tied to the trial?" Edward's mind raced, the final pieces of the puzzle snapping into place. Hugo, the stray dog, must have stumbled upon the storage unit, somehow retrieved the key, and, by some miraculous stroke of fate or instinct, brought it to the courtroom. The connection between Ethan, Daniel, and the key was undeniable now. "Ethan," Edward said, her tone turning serious, "you've just uncovered the missing link in this case. I need you to come with me to the courthouse and provide a statement." Back in the courtroom, the tension was palpable as the trial resumed. Daniel, now visibly anxious, shot nervous glances at his lawyer. He knew the stakes were higher than ever, and he had no way of predicting what would happen next. Edward rose to her feet, prepared to present the latest developments to Judge William. She introduced Ethan Dawson to the court. "Your Honor," Edward began, addressing the judge, "this is Ethan Dawson, a retired locksmith who worked for Mr. Daniel several years ago. He has confirmed that the key brought to us by the stray dog, Justice, was made for a private storage unit owned by the defendant." The courtroom erupted into whispers as the revelation sank in. Daniel's lawyer leapt to his feet, objecting immediately, citing hearsay, but Judge William, ever composed, raised a hand to silence him. "Let the witness speak," she said, her voice calm yet firm. Ethan took the stand, his voice steady as he recounted the events. Despite his age, he spoke with surprising clarity. He described how Daniel had hired him under suspicious circumstances, paying him extra to keep quiet. I didn't know what he was hiding in that unit, Ethan concluded, his voice tinged with regret. But I knew it wasn't above board. Edward pressed forward, presenting additional damning evidence from the storage unit, documents that directly implicated Daniel in the embezzlement scheme. These records, she said, holding up several files for the courtroom to see, combined with Mr. Dawson's testimony, establish a clear link between the defendant and the illegal activities we've uncovered. Daniel's lawyer fought to poke holes in the testimony, but the damage was already done. Jury members exchanged knowing glances. Doubt about Daniel was growing by the minute. As the court adjourned for the day, Edward allowed herself a moment to savor the victory. The case was slowly unraveling in her favor, and Justice, the stray dog, had proven to be an unlikely yet pivotal hero. But the mystery of how Hugo had ended up with the key still gnawed at her. Was it pure coincidence? Or was there something more? That evening, Edward found herself at the animal shelter once again. She sat beside Justice, scratching behind his ears, the gentle motion a quiet reflection of the incredible chain of events that had brought them to this point. "You're more than just a dog, aren't you?" Edward murmured. Justice's tail wagged, and his intelligent eyes met hers, as if to say, "You'll see." The courtroom buzzed with anticipation the following morning, as the trial resumed. The revelation about the key and its undeniable connection to Daniel had shifted the trial's dynamics completely. Rowan Daniel and his legal team sat visibly shaken, their once confident composure unraveling. Judge Matilda William entered the room, her usual calm demeanor betraying nothing of the surreal nature of the case. A stray dog had upended one of the most intricate fraud investigations of her career. At the prosecution table, Jummy's Edward reviewed her notes with practiced precision, but every so often her eyes drifted to the back of the room where Ethan Dawson, the retired locksmith, sat quietly. His testimony had proven to be the unexpected linchpin of the case, providing both credibility and context to the evidence they had so carefully assembled. Seated beside him was the true star of the day, Hugo, now affectionately nicknamed Justice. The German shepherd sat calmly, his intelligent gaze sweeping the room. Every person who noticed him seemed to pause, offering a warm smile or a respectful nod. He had become more than a mascot. He was a symbol. The defense, however, was on the ropes. Daniel's lawyer, Jasper, paced furiously, struggling to salvage a defense from the wreckage, and Daniel himself, once a confident businessman, sat rigidly in his chair, fists clenched, eyes hollow. The pressure was mounting and the cracks in his facade were starting to show. Judge William took her seat, calling the court to order. "We've reached a pivotal point in this trial," she said, her voice steady and commanding. "The evidence presented yesterday has raised significant questions about the defendant's actions and intent. Prosecutor Edward, please proceed with your next witness." Edward rose smoothly, confidence radiating from her as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Officer Rachel Torres to the stand. Officer Torres has been investigating reports of suspicious activity linked to the defendant's storage unit." Officer Torres entered, her uniform sharp and professional, her expression one of determination. She took the stand, ready to outline the investigation that had further connected Daniel to his criminal activities. "We placed the unit under surveillance for several months," Officer Torres testified, her voice steady. "There were complaints about unusual deliveries and nighttime activity. We suspected the unit was being used for illicit purposes, but we lacked the evidence to obtain a warrant, until now." Edward nodded, urging her to elaborate. "During your surveillance, did you observe anything that could directly link this unit to Mr. Daniel?" "Yes," Torres replied confidently. "We documented multiple visits by Mr. Daniel's vehicle. He frequently arrived late at night and stayed for long periods. Our records show that he made these visits consistently over the past year." The courtroom murmured as Edward presented time-stamped photographs of Daniel's car parked outside the storage facility. She turned to Judge William. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "these images further corroborate Mr. Dawson's testimony, as well as the documents recovered from the storage unit." Judge William leaned forward, her eyes narrowed. "Mr. Jasper, do you wish to cross-examine the witness?" Jasper rose, his movements stiff. "Yes, Your Honor." He approached Officer Torres with an air of forced confidence. "Officer Torres, are you absolutely certain these visits were made by my client and not someone else using his vehicle?" Torres didn't flinch. "Yes, sir. In addition to visual confirmation, we matched the license plate. The vehicle is registered to Mr. Daniel. There's no doubt it was him." Jasper pushed back, grasping for alternative explanations, but his efforts fell flat. The jurors' expressions told the story. His doubts were not convincing them. Meanwhile, Daniel sat like a man cornered. His eyes darted nervously around the room, searching for a way out that no longer existed. During the recess, Edward approached Judge William with an unusual request. "Your Honor," she began, "I'd like to formally introduce Justice as a key figure in this trial. His actions directly led to the discovery of critical evidence against Mr. Daniel. I believe his presence could help the jury understand the timeline and the extraordinary chain of events that brought us here." Judge William arched an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting we call the dog to the stand, Miss Edward?" Edward smiled softly, an understanding look in her eyes. "Not quite, Your Honor. But I do believe the jury deserves the full context. Justice's role in this case is unprecedented, and I think it's important to acknowledge that." After a brief moment of contemplation, Judge William gave a small nod. "Very well," she said. "You may proceed." When the trial resumed, Prosecutor Jomis Edward stood before the jury, her voice clear and composed. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "I'd like to take a moment to discuss how this key, and the evidence it led us to, came into our possession." She paused, allowing the room to settle before gesturing toward the back of the courtroom. "It was brought to us by this remarkable dog, Justice." All eyes turned toward the German shepherd who sat beside Ethan Dawson. The dog's ears perked up, his posture proud and alert. For a moment, the courtroom was still, everyone silently taking in the unlikely hero at the heart of the case. "Justice's actions might seem extraordinary, even unbelievable," Edward continued, "but they highlight an important truth. Sometimes the most unlikely heroes bring the truth to light. His instincts, his determination. These are traits we associate with loyalty, with integrity, and in this case they've proven invaluable." The jurors nodded slowly, their expressions softening. Even Judge William allowed herself the smallest of smiles. But on the defense side, the atmosphere was unraveling. Daniel leaned toward his attorney, his voice low and frantic. We needed to do something. This can't go on." Jasper shook his head grimly. "There's nothing we can do. The evidence is airtight, and the jury's already turning." Daniel clenched his fists, his knuckles white. "This isn't over," he hissed. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, a quiet sense of momentum settled over the courtroom. The jury had been moved not just by the facts, but by the story, by the why behind the what. For Edward, it was no longer just about exposing Daniel's crimes. It was about proving that truth and integrity, no matter how unlikely their source, could prevail. Outside the courtroom, whispers of Justice's heroism swept through the public. Reporters spun the story into headlines. Legal analysts debated the case on evening broadcasts. The courtroom buzzed not only with tension but with awe. But while the world leaned in closer, fascinated, the defense team scrambled behind the scenes, desperate to find a crack in the narrative. Anything to redirect the tide. That evening, as the courthouse lights dimmed and silence returned to the halls, Jomis Edward sat alone in her office, surrounded by files and evidence logs. She was exhausted, but focused. Her phone buzzed. An email. Subject, anonymous tip. Justice and Daniel connection. Edward's brows furrowed as she opened it. The message was brief, but its contents were explosive. Justice was no stray. He was trained by Daniel years ago for private security on his estate. Investigate further. You'll find more than you expect. No sender name. No contact info. Just a sentence that turned her entire understanding of the case on its head. Could it be true? Had the very dog who helped bring Daniel down once belonged to him? And if so, why did he turn? Was his behavior truly instinctual, or was there a deeper layer still hidden beneath the surface? The implications were staggering and troubling. Edward knew there was only one person who might hold the missing piece. Ethan Dawson. The next morning, she drove out to the farmhouse. As she pulled into the gravel drive, Justice bounded toward her with his usual enthusiasm, tail wagging and eyes bright. Ethan opened the door with a warm smile and waved her inside. They settled into the quiet kitchen, a kettle whistling softly in the background. Edward accepted the offered cup of tea and got straight to the point. Ethan, I received some information. It suggests that Justice, Hugo, might have once belonged to Rowan Daniel before this case. Do you know anything about that? Ethan's expression darkened. He leaned back in his chair, lost in thought. It's possible, he admitted slowly. When I found Hugo, Justice, he was wandering near the edge of town. He wasn't injured, looked well fed, like he'd been cared for recently. But there was no collar, no ID except the tag with my address. He paused, frowning. I always thought it was odd. A dog like him, strong, smart, trained. Dogs like that don't usually get abandoned. Edward's heart pounded. The pieces were shifting again, revealing a shadowy outline beneath the story they thought they knew. If Justice had once belonged to Daniel, why did he turn against him? And more importantly, what else did he know? Edward's mind raced. You didn't recognize the key on his collar? She asked. Ethan shook his head slowly. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured it was from a random job I'd done years ago. But now that I think about it, he trailed off, his eyes narrowing as memories stirred. I did do some work for Daniel in the past. He had a security team, trained dogs. The room seemed to still around them. The implications were staggering. If Justice had once been one of Daniel's trained security dogs, then his presence in the courtroom wasn't coincidence, it was fate. Meanwhile, back at the courthouse, Rowan Daniel was coming undone. During a recess, he cornered Jasper in the hallway, his face flushed with panic and rage. We need to take control of this story, he hissed. If they dig too deep into Justice's past, they'll find things I can't afford to have exposed. Jasper, equally worn down, threw up his hands. There's no way to stop this train, Rowan. The evidence is overwhelming. The jury's already on her side, and the dogs, unless you've got a miracle up your sleeve. Daniel's expression shifted. Dark, cold, dangerous. If they're going to dig into Justice, he muttered, eyes narrowing, then maybe we give them something else to dig into. The next day, the courtroom was rocked by a shocking revelation. A video had surfaced online. Grainy, shaky, but clear enough. It showed Justice, teeth bared, lunging at a man on what appeared to be a construction site. The man, later identified as a former Daniel employee, was shoved to the ground in the scuffle. The defense seized the opportunity like vultures. Jasper played the video in court. Your Honor, he said with performative gravity, this footage raises serious concerns about the animal's temperament. Is this the behavior of a hero or of an unpredictable, possibly dangerous animal? Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Even Judge William looked momentarily shaken. But Edward stood her ground. She calmly requested a recess to verify the authenticity of the footage. Then behind the scenes, she and her team worked tirelessly to track down the source. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. The video had been edited, its context twisted. The original security footage, retrieved directly from the site, told a very different story. Justice hadn't been attacking, he had been protecting. The unedited video showed a child, no older than 6, wandering into a hazardous area. A steel beam, loosened by wind, fell toward the child, and Justice, without hesitation, lunged forward, pushing the child away and placing himself directly in harm's path. Back in court, Edward addressed the room with a fire in her voice. Your Honor, the defense has attempted to mislead this court, she said, holding up the evidence. The footage was altered to discredit Justice, but the original tells the truth. She played the real video. Gasps echoed across the room. The jury sat in stunned silence, watching Justice sacrifice his safety to protect a child. When the video ended, several jurors wiped at their eyes. Jasper's ploy had backfired spectacularly. As the day wound down, Edward allowed herself a rare pause. The truth, once again, had proven stronger than any fabrication, and Justice had shown the world, again, that his instincts were not aggressive, but noble. This trial had become more than a legal battle. It was now a living testament to the bond between humans and animals and the extraordinary power of loyalty. The following day, tension returned like a heavy fog. Though Daniel's attempt to smear Justice had collapsed, the emotional ripple effects lingered. The jury appeared visibly shaken, not just by the drama but by the layered, evolving truth behind the case. Edward stepped up to the bench once more. This time, she called the man who knew Justice best. "Mr. Ethan Dawson," she said, "please take the stand." Ethan shuffled forward, nerves in his expression. He adjusted his glasses as he sat, hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Dawson," Edward began gently, "can you describe how you first encountered Justice?" Ethan cleared his throat. "It was a stormy night," he said. "I heard scratching at my back door. When I opened it, there he was, wet, shivering, looking like he'd been wandering for miles. I couldn't turn him away." Edward nodded. "And did you notice anything unusual about him?" Ethan's eyes lifted, distant with memory. "Yes, he had a collar and a key attached to it. At first, I didn't think much of it, figured it might have belonged to a past owner, but then I recognized the shape. It was one of mine, a custom design." The jury leaned in. "And what did you discover when you examined it?" Edward asked. Ethan's voice dropped into a whisper. "It matched a secure storage unit I'd worked on years ago. I never imagined it would resurface, let alone on a dog's collar." Edward turned to the jury. Her voice rang clear. "So this key, this piece of evidence, was carried to your doorstep by a dog you'd never met, and it led us directly to the defendant's hidden documents. Is that correct?" Ethan nodded solemnly. "Yes, ma'am." Edward stepped back. Then Jasper rose, sharp and defensive. His tone shifted to cold interrogation. "Mr. Dawson," he snapped, "isn't it possible the dog came from anywhere? That the key, your so-called evidence, might not even be connected to my client?" Ethan frowned, hands tightening on the witness stand. "It's possible," he said, "but unlikely. That key was custom. And Justice, he led me exactly where I needed to go. That's not luck. That's something else." "I suppose it's possible, but—" Ethan's voice faltered. Jasper's interruption came fast and sharp, cutting through the quiet like a blade. "But you're not certain, are you?" he said, voice rising. "You can't definitively prove that this dog has any connection to my client." "Objection," Edward snapped. "Sustained," Judge Williams said, leveling a warning look at Jasper. "Watch your tone, counselor." But the damage had been done. The seed of doubt had been planted. Jurors shifted in their seats, whispering. Eyes flicked to Justice, then to each other. The air grew thick with tension, and Edward felt the delicate balance she had worked so hard to maintain start to tilt. During the lunch recess, Edward sat alone in the courthouse cafeteria, a cold cup of coffee cradled in her hands. Her mind raced. She could feel it. The defense was exploiting the emotional gravity of the case, twisting uncertainty into suspicion. Justice, once the unspoken heart of the courtroom, now stood under scrutiny. She needed to reclaim the narrative. Fast. "Miss Edward?" She looked up to see Ethan, standing awkwardly with Justice at his side. The dog's eyes watched her quietly, loyal and alert. "I've been thinking about what Jasper said," Ethan admitted, lowering himself into the seat across from her. "Maybe he's right. Maybe we can't prove where Justice came from." Edward shook her head firmly. "Don't let him get to you, Ethan. The facts speak for themselves. Justice led us to the key, and the key led us to the truth. That's what matters." Ethan reached down and scratched Justice gently behind the ears. "He's a good dog, Ms. Edward. I just hope the jury sees that." Back in the courtroom, the tension coiled tighter than ever. Edward took a breath, then rose with a new strategy. She needed to reframe the narrative, cut through emotion with clarity, with science. "I called Dr. Sarah Bennett to the stand." A calm presence swept into the room as the animal behaviorist took her place. Her soft voice carried a quiet authority. "Dr. Bennett," Edward began, "can you help us understand what might drive a dog like Justice to behave the way he did?" Dr. Bennett smiled. "Dogs are deeply intuitive. They form powerful bonds with humans and are driven by loyalty, protection, even empathy. In Justice's case, his behavior is consistent with a dog acting on highly developed instincts." Edward nodded. "Would you say Justice's actions, retrieving the key, leading Ethan to the unit, suggest a history of training?" "Absolutely," Dr. Bennett replied. Not only did he retrieve a specific object, he brought it to someone he'd just met and remained engaged throughout the process. That's behavior we typically see in dogs trained for search, retrieval, or protection work. Edward turned to the jury, her voice deliberate. So even if Justice's origins are unclear, his actions in this case show intelligence, intuition, and loyalty. Would you agree? Dr. Bennett didn't hesitate. Without question. The room seemed to soften. Jurors exchanged looks of recognition. The pendulum was swinging back, but Jasper was ready. He rose from his seat like a man with a mission, his voice low and cold. Dr. Bennett, isn't it true that all dogs, regardless of training, can act unpredictably? Dr. Bennett tilted her head, considering. To some extent, yes, but unpredictability often stems from fear or mistreatment. Justice's behavior reflects structure, discipline, and care. That's not unpredictability, that's conditioning. Jasper pressed harder, but Dr. Bennett's calm didn't waver. Her poise, her certainty, it held, and the jury's doubt seemed to loosen piece by piece. By the end of the day, Edward felt a renewed hope. The truth was holding. Justice's presence in the courtroom remained a quiet force, a living reminder of the bond between humans and animals, a bond strong enough to pierce through doubt, through fear, even through deceit. But just as the storm seemed to settle, the winds shifted again. The next morning, tension electrified the courtroom as Jasper approached the bench with a new folder clutched tightly in his hand. His face was grim, but determined. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady, "the defense has obtained new evidence that directly challenges the prosecution's reliance on the dog known as Justice." Edward stiffened. "What evidence?" she demanded, suspicion laced in every syllable. Jasper opened the folder, sliding a set of papers toward the judge. "These are records," he said, indicating that Justice's real name is Hugo and that he was once part of a specialized K-9 training program for private security. According to these documents, Hugo was trained specifically to retrieve objects. Gasps rippled across the room. Edward's jaw clenched, her heartbeat surged. This wasn't just a twist, this was strategy. Jasper had just reframed the entire case. He wasn't questioning Justice's behavior anymore. He was trying to redefine it, rebrand the dog as nothing more than a tool, a trained mechanism executing commands without emotional awareness or intent. The narrative was shifting once more, and Edward knew she'd have to fight harder than ever to protect the truth, and that his presence at the crime scene may not have been as coincidental as the prosecution claims. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. The jury exchanged looks, curiosity piqued by this new development. For a brief moment, the tension in the room thickened, but Edward, ever composed, refused to let herself be rattled. She stood with determination. "Your Honor," she addressed the judge calmly, "I request a brief recess to review these documents and prepare a rebuttal." During the recess, Edward and her team huddled around the table, poring over the newly presented documents. The papers appeared legitimate, detailed accounts of Justice's enrollment in a private K-9 training facility, followed by his deployment to a security firm owned by none other than Rowan Daniel. It was shocking, yes, but not entirely unexpected. Edward had always suspected there was more to Justice's story than met the eye. She turned to her assistant, Ava, a sharp young paralegal who had been instrumental in gathering the case's evidence. "We need to verify the authenticity of these records," Edward said, eyes narrowing in thought. "And we need to know why Daniel's team waited until now to bring this forward." Ava's fingers flew across the laptop keyboard, her focus unwavering. "I'm on it," she said, already diving deep into the digital trail. "If these records are real, there has to be more to the story." Back in the courtroom, the jury was visibly shifting. The defense's revelation had planted a seed of doubt, one that suggested Justice's actions might not have been entirely instinctual, but rather orchestrated or influenced by his previous training. Jasper, sensing the opportunity, seized it. He called Martin Hayes, a gruff former trainer from the K-9 facility, to the stand. Hayes looked confident, but there was something in his eyes that betrayed unease. "Yes," Hayes said when asked about Justice's former name. "I remember Hugo. He was one of the best dogs we ever trained. Sharp, obedient, incredibly loyal." Jasper leaned forward, his voice smooth. "Mr. Hayes, can you describe the kind of training Hugo received?" Of course, Hayes replied without hesitation. He was trained in retrieval, tracking, and object recognition. If you gave him a command, he'd follow it without hesitation. Jasper's lips twitched into a subtle smile as he turned to address the jury. So it's fair to say that Hugo's ability to find and retrieve the key was a result of his training, not some miraculous instinct? Hayes hesitated, glancing down at Justice, now lying quietly at Ethan Dawson's feet. I suppose you could say that, he said, though his tone lacked the conviction expected from an expert witness. When it was Edward's turn, she immediately went on the offensive. Mr. Hayes, she began, her voice steady but sharp. You mentioned that Hugo was trained at your facility. Can you confirm whether he was still under your care or Daniel's employ at the time of the events in question? Hayes shifted uncomfortably. No, he wasn't. He'd been missing for years. We assumed he was either stolen or abandoned. Edward's eyes flashed with an opportunity. So you can't definitively say that his actions during this case were influenced by your training program? Hayes hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously toward Justice again. No, I can't. Edward nodded, a quiet triumph in her eyes as she turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here, she said, her voice calm and powerful, is a dog who, despite being abandoned and left to fend for himself, demonstrated remarkable intelligence and loyalty. His training may have been part of his past, but his actions in this case were his own. They were his choices, a testament to the bond between humans and animals and the extraordinary nature of this particular dog. Outside the courtroom, Ava returned with new information. Edward's eyes scanned the emails Ava had uncovered, her breath catching as she read through them. The emails between Daniel and the K9 facility painted a damning picture. They revealed that Daniel had deliberately abandoned Justice, deeming him useless after a failed security job. The emails even contained references to Daniel's pattern of cruelty and neglect toward the animals he had employed. Edward's heart sank with a quiet fury. Without hesitation, she made her move. Back in the courtroom, she stood with purpose, holding the emails in her hands. Your Honor, she addressed Judge William, her voice now filled with the weight of revelation. These emails show that the defendant not only abandoned Justice, but also demonstrated a consistent pattern of cruelty and negligence toward the animals under his employ. She paused, letting the silence settle over the room. Justice's role in this case is not a coincidence, it's poetic justice. The mood in the courtroom shifted. The jury's expressions darkened as they processed the weight of the new information. Their initial doubts about Justice's loyalty were quickly overtaken by the undeniable truth. Rowan Daniel had abandoned him, left him to suffer. Now Justice was offering the one thing Daniel could never take away, redemption. Daniel's actions were not just criminal, they were monstrous. And now the truth was clear. Edward leaned back, a quiet sense of resolve settling over her. The momentum was hers again, but deeply unethical, and Justice's actions now carried even greater weight. As the day drew to a close, Edward reflected on the escalating tension and the intricate web of revelations that had unfolded. The defense's attempts to undermine Justice's role had backfired spectacularly, revealing even more about Daniel's character and solidifying the dog's role as a hero in the eyes of the jury. Justice, as if sensing the shift, rested his head on Ethan's knee, his eyes calm and trusting. Edward couldn't help but smile. The case was far from over, but she knew they were one step closer to the truth and to justice. The courtroom had transformed into a stage for a drama no one had anticipated. Each day seemed to bring new revelations. What had begun as a simple case about a crime had evolved into something much larger, about loyalty, redemption, and the unexpected heroes that could emerge from the most unlikely places. The following morning, Edward arrived at the courthouse feeling cautiously optimistic. The emails Ava had uncovered had shaken the defense's confidence. The jury appeared to be leaning toward the prosecution's narrative. However, Edward knew better than to rely solely on the emotional pull of Justice's story. To secure a conviction, she needed indisputable evidence. Before the trial resumed, Edward met with Ethan Dawson and Justice in a quiet corner of the courthouse. Justice wagged his tail as Ethan scratched behind his ears, his voice filled with emotion. "He's something special," Ethan said. "I've never seen a dog like him." Edward nodded, her eyes softening. He's the heart of this case, Ethan. But we need more than that to ensure Daniel is held accountable. We have to connect every dot and every piece of evidence. Ethan looked thoughtful, then said, "What if justice can help us again? He's led us this far." Edward smiled faintly. "We'll see. For now, let's focus on what we know." Back in the courtroom, Edward called Detective Elena Ruiz to the stand. Detective Ruiz had been instrumental in recovering the physical evidence from Daniel's property, including the stolen items linked to the crime. Her testimony would be the final piece tying everything together and creating a clear timeline that left no room for doubt. "Detective Ruiz," Edward began, her voice steady, "can you describe the scene when you searched the defendant's property?" Ruiz leaned forward, her tone professional and deliberate. "We found several items that matched descriptions from the victim's family: antique watches, jewelry, and other valuables. They were hidden in a locked storage unit behind the main house." Edward gestured toward the evidence table. "And how did you gain access to the storage unit?" Ruiz glanced down at Justice, who was lying quietly at Ethan's feet. "The key was provided to us by Mr. Dawson, who received it from Justice. Without it, we wouldn't have been able to search the unit." Edward turned toward the jury. "So, Justice's actions directly led to the discovery of evidence critical to this case." Ruiz nodded. "That's correct." As Edward stepped back, Jasper rose for his cross-examination. He aimed to downplay the significance of Ruiz's testimony, attempting to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the evidence. "Detective Ruiz," Jasper began, his tone sharp, "isn't it possible that the evidence could have been planted, or that it was obtained under questionable circumstances?" This felt like a desperate attempt from the defense to salvage their weakening position. Jasper's insinuation was aimed at unsettling the jury, but Edward had anticipated such tactics. She watched the room carefully, her confidence growing as she prepared to counter every attempt to undermine the facts. Circumstances, however, Ruiz's calm and detailed responses left little room for doubt. Frustrated, Jasper turned his attention back to Justice. "Detective Ruiz, would you say that relying on a dog to provide evidence is unconventional?" Ruiz didn't miss a beat. "Perhaps, but unconventional doesn't mean unreliable. Justice's actions were consistent with his training and instincts. He's proven himself to be a vital part of this investigation." Jasper pressed on, but the jury's expression suggested they weren't buying his arguments. The bond between Justice and the case was too strong to break. During the lunch recess, Edward and Ava reviewed their strategy for the afternoon session. Ava had uncovered additional information about Daniel's activities, including records of payments to the K9 training facility that suggested a deeper involvement in the illegal trade of trained animals. "This could be the smoking gun," Ava said, sliding the documents across the table. Edward studied them carefully. "If we can prove that Daniel was using these dogs for illicit purposes, and then discarding them, it not only strengthens our case but also shows a pattern of behavior." When court resumed, Edward presented the documents detailing transactions between Daniel and several organizations known for questionable practices, including the purchase of trained K9s. The jury listened intently as Edward outlined how these deals connected to Justice's past and Daniel's criminal enterprise. "Daniel didn't just commit theft," Edward concluded. "He exploited and discarded living creatures for his own gain, showing a complete lack of regard for both human and animal life." The jury's reaction was palpable. The weight of Daniel's actions was becoming increasingly clear, and the emotional undercurrent of the trial grew stronger as the day drew to a close. Edward decided to call Ethan Dawson back to the stand. She wanted to remind the jury of the human element in the case, the way justice had brought people together and revealed the truth. "Mr. Dawson," Edward began, "can you describe how justice has impacted your life since he appeared on your doorstep?" Ethan smiled, his gaze shifting to the dog. "Justice saved me as much as I saved him. I was lonely and my farm was struggling. Then he showed up, carrying that key and changing everything. He's not just a dog, he's a miracle." Edward nodded. "And do you believe that Justice's actions in this case were intentional? That he understood what he was doing?" Ethan's voice was steady. "I do. He's got a heart bigger than most people I've met. He knew what was right, and he acted on it." As Ethan stepped down, the courtroom fell silent. Justice wagged his tail, as if sensing the growing support around him. Edward felt a surge of hope. The connections between the characters, Ethan, Justice, and even Daniel, had been laid bare, creating a narrative that was impossible to ignore. The air in the courtroom was charged with tension as the trial neared its most critical juncture. Every piece of evidence, every testimony, and every moment justice had played a role in was leading to this point. The prosecution and defense were locked in a battle, each determined to sway the jury. For Edward, this was the moment she had been preparing for, a decisive push that would leave no doubt about Daniel's guilt. The case is nearing its most intense moment. Edward's efforts to present irrefutable evidence and highlight the bond between Ethan and Justice have created a compelling narrative. The jury is leaning in her favor, but Jasper is still trying to disrupt the flow. It's anyone's guess how the final moments of the trial will unfold. The day began with Jasper attempting to regain control of the narrative. His strategy was to undermine the prosecution's emotional appeal by focusing on cold, hard facts, or rather, casting doubt on them. He called to the stand a private investigator hired by the defense to scrutinize Justice's role in the case. The investigator, a stern-looking man named Grayson Hill, took his seat with a composed demeanor. Jasper wasted no time diving into his questions. Mr. Hill, in your expert opinion, could the actions of this dog, Justice, be interpreted as coincidence rather than intent? Hill nodded. It's possible. Dogs often act on instinct, and what may appear as deliberate behavior could simply be chance. Jasper smiled as though this single statement had dismantled the prosecution's case. So you're saying it's unlikely this dog consciously retrieved a key related to the crime? Hill shrugged. Unlikely, yes. Without further evidence, we can't definitively say the dog knew what it was doing. Edward rose for cross-examination, her face calm, but her eyes sharp. She approached Hill with measured steps. Her tone was steady. Mr. Hill, are you a certified animal behaviorist? Hill blinked, momentarily thrown off. No, I'm not, Edward continued, her voice firm. So your opinion on Justice's behavior is based purely on speculation? Hill hesitated. I suppose you could say that. Edward nodded. Thank you, Mr. Hill. No further questions. Her point was clear. The defense's attempt to discredit Justice was built on shaky ground. The jury took note, their focus shifting back to the undeniable facts of the case. The prosecution's next move was to present the timeline of events leading up to Justice's discovery of the key. Ava, who had meticulously pieced together surveillance footage, cell data, and witness accounts, took the stand to testify. Using a series of visuals displayed on the courtroom screens, Ava walked the jury through the sequence of events. This footage shows Justice approaching the shed where the key was hidden, she explained, pointing to a grainy video clip. And here, you can see him returning to Mr. Dawson with the key in his mouth. Edward leaned forward, addressing the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this wasn't a random act. Justice's actions were deliberate and pointed, leading us directly to the evidence that unraveled the defendant's crimes. Jasper objected, claiming the footage was circumstantial and didn't prove intent. Judge William allowed the objection but permitted Edward to continue. The defense's counter-arguments were growing weaker. Their attempts to discredit Justice and the evidence were losing traction. As the day wore on, the tension in the courtroom reached a boiling point. Daniel, who had remained stoic throughout the trial, began to show signs of agitation. His lawyer frequently whispered to him, attempting to keep him calm, but the cracks in his composure were becoming evident. Ms. Evans, Edward began, her voice kind but firm. Can you tell the court about your experience working for Mr. Daniel? Clara hesitated, glancing nervously at Daniel before speaking. I worked for him for 3 years. At first, it seemed like a normal job, but over time I realized there were things happening that weren't right. Edward nodded encouragingly. What kind of things? Clara took a deep breath. He was involved in illegal activities, smuggling rare items and animals. Justice was one of the dogs he used for these operations. When Justice failed a mission, he abandoned him. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge William banged his gavel, calling for order. Edward seized the moment, her voice rising with conviction. Ms. Evans, are you saying that the defendant not only committed theft, but also exploited animals like Justice for his criminal activities? Yes, Clara said, her voice steady now. Justice was trained to retrieve items for him, but when he didn't perform to his expectations, he was left to fend for himself. Edward turned to the jury, her expression fierce. Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't just a case about theft. It's about a man who exploited and discarded living creatures for his own gain. Justice didn't just find that key, he sought redemption for the mistreatment he endured, and in doing so, he exposed the truth about Roe and Daniel. Daniel's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The jury's expressions revealed that Edward's words had struck a chord. The emotional weight of the case was undeniable, and the pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the trial reached its penultimate stage. Each side had laid their cards on the table, and the jury was on the edge of their seats, waiting to see how the pieces would fall. For Edward, this moment wasn't just about presenting evidence. It was about delivering a story so compelling that the jury couldn't look away. A story that demanded justice, not just for Ethan and his farm, but for Justice the dog himself. The next day began with Roe and Daniel taking the stand. It was a calculated risk by the defense, but they were running out of options. Jasper hoped Daniel could sway the jury by presenting himself as a misunderstood businessman who had been wrongfully accused. However, Edward saw this as an opportunity to dismantle his narrative piece by piece. Daniel took his seat, his demeanor confident but guarded. Jasper began with soft questions, painting Daniel as a hard-working man who had been unfairly targeted. Ms. Daniel, can you tell us about your business and how you've contributed to the community? Daniel nodded, his voice measured. I've run a successful logistics company for over a decade. We've provided jobs, supported local charities, and helped countless businesses thrive. Jasper smiled, turning to the jury as if to say, "See, he's just a regular guy." But Edward was already preparing to strike. When it was her turn to cross-examine, Edward's tone was calm but sharp. "Mr. Daniel, you've described yourself as a community leader, but let's talk about your other activities. Can you explain why multiple witnesses have testified that you were involved in illegal trafficking?" Daniel stiffened, his confidence faltering. "Those are baseless accusations." Edward raised an eyebrow. "Baseless? Clara Evans testified under oath about your involvement. Are you saying she lied?" Daniel hesitated. "I'm saying she's mistaken." Edward leaned forward, her voice cutting through the room. "Mistaken about the forged documents, the stolen goods, all the trained dogs you abandoned when they no longer served your purpose?" The courtroom was silent. All eyes were on Daniel. He shifted uncomfortably but didn't respond. Edward pressed on. "Let's talk about justice. Witnesses have confirmed that, at this moment, Daniel's carefully constructed persona was beginning to crumble. Would Edward's questioning be enough to tip the scales toward a conviction? Would the jury see the truth behind Daniel's actions? The final push for justice was nearing. "He was trained under your supervision. Can you deny that?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "I didn't personally train him." "But you knew about it," Edward countered. "And when he didn't meet your expectations, you abandoned him. Isn't that true?" Daniel tried to deflect. "That's not relevant to this case." Edward's voice rose slightly, her passion shining through. "It's entirely relevant. Justice's actions led to the discovery of the key, the stolen goods, and ultimately your criminal activities. He's not just a dog in this case, Mr. Daniel. He's a victim and a hero." As Daniel stepped down, visibly shaken, Edward turned to the jury for her final arguments. She began by recounting the journey of justice, from an abandoned dog to a courtroom hero. Her words painted a vivid picture of loyalty, resilience, and the search for truth. "Justice was thrown away like he didn't matter," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "But he didn't give up. He found his way to Ethan Dawson, and when the time came, he did what no one else could. He uncovered the truth." She then shifted her focus to Daniel. "On the other hand, we have a man who exploited animals, broke the law, and tried to cover his tracks. He thought he could get away with it, but justice had other plans." Jasper's closing arguments were subdued. He tried to cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative, suggesting that the evidence was circumstantial and that Justice's actions were coincidental. But his words lacked conviction, and the jury's attention seemed to drift. As the jury was dismissed to deliberate, the courtroom emptied, leaving Edward, Ethan, and Justice to wait in intense silence. Ethan stroked Justice's fur, his eyes filled with gratitude and worry. "Do you think they'll see the truth?" he asked. Edward placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "They have everything they need to make the right decision." Hours later, the jury returned. The courtroom filled once more as everyone awaited the verdict. The four persons stood, holding the small slip of paper that would decide Daniel's fate. In the matter of Rowan Daniel, we find the defendant guilty on all counts. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Ethan hugged Justice tightly, tears streaming down his face. Edward closed her eyes briefly, letting the weight of the moment wash over her. For her, they had done it. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, eager for a statement. Edward addressed the crowd, her voice firm and resolute. This case was about more than just theft. It was about loyalty, courage, and the bond between humans and animals. Justice reminded us all of what's truly important, and I hope this serves as a reminder to protect and cherish every life. Ethan spoke next, his words simple but heartfelt. Justice saved my life in more ways than one. I'll never forget what he's done for me and this community. As the crowd cheered and cameras flashed, Justice wagged his tail, seemingly unfazed by the attention. He had done what he was meant to do, and now he was ready to return home to a farm where he was loved and valued. The air in the courtroom buzzed with the energy of the verdict, while the declaration of Daniel's guilt was met with a surge of relief and quiet cheers. But the emotional peak of the story had not yet arrived. For Ethan, Edward, and Justice, the moment was about more than legal triumph. It was about closure, justice, and redemption. As the court emptied, Judge William called Edward, Ethan, and Justice forward to the bench. The judge removed his glasses and looked down at Justice, who sat obediently by Ethan's side, his tail wagging faintly. "I've presided over hundreds of cases," Judge Williams said, his voice softer than it had been throughout the trial. "But I've never seen anything like this. Justice isn't just a dog. He's a symbol of loyalty and courage. Ethan, you're lucky to have him, and I believe the community is lucky to have both of you." Ethan's voice cracked as he responded, "Your Honor, I think I'm the lucky one. Justice saved my life twice. I'll never be able to repay him for what he's done." The judge nodded, acknowledging the profound bond between Ethan and Justice. In that moment, it wasn't just about the legal victory, it was a recognition of loyalty, sacrifice, and the transformative power of the connection between a man and his dog. This marked the end of the trial, but it was only the beginning of the next chapter for Ethan and Justice. Redemption had been earned, justice served, and a hero had emerged in the most unexpected of places. Solemnly sometimes, Ethan, the best way to repay loyalty is with love, and from what I've seen, Justice is already receiving plenty of that. Edward, standing beside Ethan, couldn't help but feel a surge of pride, not just in the case, but in the bond between Ethan and Justice. The judge's words resonated deeply, and Edward knew that their work had transcended the courtroom. "Your Honor," she interjected, her voice steady, "Justice didn't just save Ethan, he brought the truth to light, something that might never have happened without him." Judge Williams smiled faintly. "That he did, and it's a lesson for all of us, to trust in the unexpected and recognize the extraordinary in what we often overlook." Outside the courthouse, the press eagerly awaited a glimpse of Justice, now a local hero. Cameras flashed as Edward, Ethan, and Justice stepped out onto the courthouse steps. The crowd cheered, some holding signs that read "Justice for Justice" and "Hero Dog of the Year." One reporter shouted, "Ethan, what's next for Justice?" Ethan smiled, ruffling the fur on Justice's neck. "He's going back to the farm where he belongs. He's earned a quiet life, but I think he'll always be ready for the next adventure." Another reporter turned to Edward. "Do you think this case will set a precedent?" Edward nodded firmly. "Absolutely. This case isn't just about one man's crimes or one dog's actions. It's a reminder of the incredible bonds between humans and animals and the importance of justice for all lives, no matter the species." As the media frenzy continued, a small group from the local animal shelter approached. They presented Ethan with a plaque that read, "In honor of justice, for loyalty, courage, and unwavering devotion." Ethan held the plaque in his hands, his voice breaking as he addressed the crowd. "This is for justice, but it's also for every animal out there who's been abandoned or mistreated. Justice is a reminder that every life has value and every soul deserves a chance." The crowd erupted into applause as Justice barked, seemingly in response to the cheer. The sound brought laughter and tears to those gathered, cementing his status as not just a hero, but a beloved member of the community. That evening, Ethan, Edward, and Justice returned to the farm. The The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the fields. Ethan stood by the fence, watching his animals graze, while Justice lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws. Edward joined him, a contented smile on her face. "It feels like the storm has finally passed," she said softly. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I never thought I'd see the day where everything felt right again. Justice brought me back to life, Edward. I owe him everything." Edward reached down to scratch behind Justice's ears. "I think he knows that, and I think he feels the same way about you." As the stars began to emerge in the night sky, Ethan knelt beside Justice, speaking to him as though he were an old friend. "You've done more than I could have ever asked, buddy. You've given me hope again. I promise you'll always have a home here." Justice licked Ethan's hand in response, his tail wagging gently. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes, a bond forged through adversity and sealed with love. In the following weeks, Justice became a local legend. Schools invited Ethan to speak about his story, sharing lessons of resilience and compassion. Justice accompanied him, always sitting proudly by his side as children listened with wide-eyed wonder. The story of Justice, the dog who had been thrown away and found his way back into a world of love and purpose, spread far and wide. His legacy wasn't just the case he helped solve, it was the way he had reminded everyone of the power of loyalty, the importance of compassion, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and animals. Edward found herself inspired by the case. She started a community initiative aimed at supporting abandoned animals, using Justice's story as a rallying cry. The program, named Justice's Legacy, aimed to provide care, shelter, and second chances to animals in need. It quickly gained traction, bringing the town together with a shared goal of making a difference in the lives of animals who had been abandoned or mistreated. But for Ethan and Justice, life eventually returned to a peaceful rhythm. Days were spent tending to the farm, with Justice happily following Ethan wherever he went. Nights were quiet, filled with the sounds of crickets and the rustle of the wind through the trees. It was a life of simplicity, one that both Ethan and Justice had earned. One evening, as Ethan sat on the porch with a cup of tea, Justice curled up at his feet. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink. It was a reminder that even after the darkest storms, there is always light. Looking down at Justice, Ethan smiled. "You're more than a dog, Justice. You're my family." In the stillness of the evening, with the world at peace, it was clear that Justice felt the same. The tranquility of the farm was a stark contrast to the whirlwind of events that had unfolded in the courtroom and the town. For Ethan and Justice, life had settled back into its natural rhythm. But the echoes of their story continued to ripple far beyond the quiet fields. Justice had become a symbol, a reminder that loyalty, courage, and determination could come from the most unexpected places. News outlets across the country continued to cover his story, sharing the incredible journey of a dog who had not only saved his owner, but uncovered a web of deceit and criminality. Ethan found himself adjusting to his newfound recognition. The farm, once struggling to make ends meet, was now thriving thanks to the attention their story had brought. Visitors from all over wanted to meet Justice, the hero dog, and Ethan welcomed them with open arms, sharing his story with anyone who cared to listen. But fame never changed Justice. To him, the world was simple: protect Ethan, care for the animals, and bask in the affection of the people who came to see him. He remained the same loyal companion who had braved storms and danger to defend his owner. One afternoon, as Ethan repaired the barn door, a car pulled up to the driveway. Edward stepped out, her bright smile immediately lighting up the scene. In her arms, she held a small stack of papers. "Ethan," she called, walking toward him. "I've got something for you." Ethan wiped his hands on his overalls and met her halfway, his curiosity piqued. "What's this?" he asked, taking the papers. Edward grinned. "It's official recognition from the mayor's office. Justice is being honored as the town's first honorary guardian. They want to dedicate a day to him every year, Justice Day." Ethan laughed, shaking his head. "That dog's gonna have more accolades than I'll ever see in my lifetime." Justice, lying in the shade nearby, perked up his ears at the sound of his name, wagging his tail lazily. Edward knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. "He deserves it, Ethan, and so do you. What you both did went beyond just saving a farm. You reminded everyone what it means to fight for what's right. The inaugural Justice Day was held in the town square a few weeks later. Families gathered, children wore t-shirts with Justice's face printed on them, and the mayor gave a heartfelt speech about the bond between humans and animals. When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he addressed the crowd with quiet sincerity. "This dog saved my life, not just once, but in so many ways. Justice isn't just a hero to me, he's family, and I hope his story inspires all of you to see the value in every life, no matter how small or overlooked." The applause that followed was deafening, and as Justice barked, the crowd erupted into laughter and cheers. He was, as always, the star of the show. As time passed, the community initiative Edward had started, Justice's Legacy, gained momentum. Donations poured in, and volunteers signed up to help animals in need. The town had rallied around the cause, driven by the powerful story of a dog who had taught everyone a lesson in loyalty, courage, and justice. The story of Justice continued to inspire far beyond the small town, creating a ripple effect that touched countless lives. His legacy was not just in the day dedicated to him, but in the hearts of the people who had witnessed his courage and the bond between him and Ethan. It was a reminder to cherish the extraordinary in the seemingly ordinary and to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. Justice himself became the face of the campaign. His story served as a beacon of hope for animals and people alike. Edward and Ethan grew closer through their shared efforts, though they never sought the limelight. Their dedication to Justice's legacy turned them into local icons of compassion and resilience. One evening, as Ethan sat on the porch watching the sunset, Edward joined him, a cup of tea in her hands. Justice lay at their feet, his head resting on Ethan's boots. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been if Justice hadn't come into your life?" Edward asked, her voice thoughtful. Ethan nodded slowly. "All the time. I don't know where I'd be without him. He gave me a reason to keep going when I thought I'd lost everything." Edward smiled, her gaze shifting to the horizon. "He's not just a dog, you know. He's a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there's always hope." As the stars began to dot the sky, Ethan reached down to pat Justice's side. "You hear that, boy? You're not just a dog, you're a miracle." Justice wagged his tail as if he understood every word. The years went by, and though the world continued to change, the bond between Ethan and Justice remained unshakable. The farm flourished, Justice's legacy expanded to neighboring towns, and their story became a part of the community's history. For Ethan, life was no longer about survival. It was about gratitude, love, and the simple joys of every day spent with his loyal companion. As the final rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon one quiet evening, Ethan sat on the porch with Justice by his side. The farm was peaceful, the air filled with the hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. Looking down at his faithful friend, Ethan whispered, "Thank you, Justice, for everything." Justice lifted his head, his eyes meeting Ethan's, and in that silent exchange, there was a lifetime's worth of understanding and love. This story of Ethan and Justice reminds us all of the incredible bond between humans and animals and the life-changing impact they can have on one another. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more heartwarming tales. And remember, every act of kindness, no matter how small, can make a world of difference. I will meet you in the next story.